Hello everyone, and I'd like to start with a short apology. I'm sorry I don't speak Italian. I'm French, so I'll make this presentation in English, and I hope that that's okay for you. Again, apologies, and thank you very much for this invitation. I'm very happy to be here. I'm very happy about my colleague's invitation. So I'm going to talk about one of my passions, cities. I've been working at JCDecaux for the past 13 years, and I'm very dedicated to how do we provide the best possible services in cities. That's what we're here for. And I think that my presentation is probably a complement to what you heard this morning from Mayor Sala and Assessore Maran. They were very focused on Milan. I would like to share maybe a wider vision of the future of cities, where they're going, and how we as a company are facing those challenges with our partners, which are cities. And of course, I'll be very glad to answer any of your questions after the presentation. We really feel that there's an important change coming in cities all over the world. And as the ex-mayor of Denver said a few years ago, the 21st century will be the century of cities. For a very obvious reason, it's that the world's population is concentrating in cities. We may think it's a good thing or a bad thing, but it's happening. The majority of humanity is living in cities and will increasingly live in cities. So that's what we need to take care of collectively at every level. So it's a new paradigm. And apart from the demographic pressure that's coming into cities, there are unprecedented challenges that we are facing everywhere in the world. It's not just in some countries or some continents. We're all part of this. Cities need to attract city dwellers. They need to attract students. They need to attract new economies. They need to be attractive to thrive. But although they represent barely 2% of the surface of the earth, we as cities consume or reject 80% of GEEs, which is a lot. So whatever we do in cities, we will need to make it more sustainable. So whenever we install, I don't know, IoT infrastructures, whenever we deliver new services, we need to think, is this sustainable? And it's a very difficult thing to do. No, I need to do this. And it's very difficult to do because cities themselves are faced with huge digital giants coming into their territories with their business models. Some of them are sustainable, some aren't. Cities are public institutions. They're very regulated. In some countries more than others, but European cities in general are very regulated. So being a mayor today, or a city official, or local government, is a very difficult job. And it's not getting easier. So about 10 years ago, the concept of smart cities started emerging. And the idea was, we can make, as companies, as local government, we can make cities better with data, with digital, with the optimization of the functioning of cities. That was 10 years ago, and it's not a surprise if the concept itself was invented by a guy at IBM. Their vision was infrastructure. If we put infrastructure, if we put digital, it will make cities better. The thing is that 10 years on, and although there have been many very interesting initiatives the world over, the smart city model just is not functioning. The smart city, as people like IBM saw it, needed to have a business model, needed to be profitable. A city is not a profitable institution. It's a living organism. So it's very difficult to think infrastructure on a living being that's evolving all the time. So some people are thinking that the smart city model is being not evacuated, but we need to go beyond this type of model. So we thought, in my team at JCDecaux, we're in charge of research, innovation. We thought it was the right time to just take a step back and think about the possible futures of cities. And we wrote a book, not about what JCDecaux does, but we went to see MIT professors, startup companies in France, in the US, in many, many different countries, just to get a feel of what the possible positive futures of cities can be. And we all have just one objective: how can we make the quality of life better for the widest possible population? It's the only aim. So it's actually the third in a series of books, but we're not very regular. The last one was in 2010, but this time we felt that cities themselves are at a crossroads. They need to think about their future model, where they want to go, where they want to take the population, and how they do it. And it's extremely difficult for them. So that's why we called it Cities, the New Deal, because right at this moment, we're beginning to put the first feelers into this new paradigm for cities. And we believe that, of course, cities need to be smart, but they need to be sustainable. They need to be very creative, and they need to be agile. They need to have the capacity for change. So I'm not going to read you the book. The paper version is only in French, but of course you can download it on our website, and I'll give you the link at the end of the presentation. But there are 6 topics that we feel are very important for the future of cities. The first one, and it seems very obvious, but cities should be made and should evolve for the people that they serve. And the people are the citizens, people who work in cities, people who go through cities, even tourists. But that needs to be the main focus. And for a very long time, that hasn't been the focus. The focus has been making roads for cars. The focus has been, for example, the economy. But now there's such a huge pressure from the citizens themselves that cities are changing the way that they are trying to evolve and build their own public spaces. And it's a very difficult thing to do, because a city in general is very mineral. There's a lot of buildings. So how can you make your city evolve in terms of services while your city is a built environment? It's difficult to do. What I found very interesting in this morning's presentation from Assessore Maran was the idea that the canals that you have in Milan could be reinvested as public spaces, as different spaces than they are today. And that creates life, and it creates a city environment, and it's a positive thing to do. So most of the time there's always a way to make sure that your city will actually evolve in the right way. One of the examples that I love is Times Square in New York, which was a paradise for big cars and, of course, huge digital billboards. Unfortunately, not ours. But today, there's a huge portion of Times Square that has been given back to people. And it's also due to the fact that in big cities in general, the places where we live, the apartments, the houses, are increasingly small because real estate prices have risen. So there's a huge trend into people living more outside and in public space than they used to. I have an example in the city of Paris. That's where I live. So that's where most of my examples are, because they're just the daily stuff that I see. The people in charge of cleaning the streets in Paris are experiencing a nightmare for the past 2 years, because there's been a huge increase in the outdoor activities of people. It may be linked to climate change. Maybe that we will need to use outside space more than we do today. In any case, it has a huge impact on the organization of the cleaning in the streets of the city of Paris. So they can't just rely on coming three times a week in every street. They need to think, when is the public space used, by whom, and when do I need to go there to make it as good as it needs to be. So that's the first dimension, and it's also linked to the fact that people want to participate more. For a very long time, citizens have been voters and consumers of certain city services. Now they want to collaborate. They want to be a part of the decisions of local government. They want the local government to ask them what they would prefer. And it needs to start at the youngest level possible. Again, I have an example from, it's not Paris, but it's a very tiny city. Citizen participation starts in schools. We have a budget to change one of these three things in your local school. Which one would you prefer? Instead of having local government decide. And that's a very, very, very huge trend. And it poses very different problems, but we'll come to that. The second dimension, and it's no surprise, is all about data. And the right use of data. And the right type of data. I see quite a few cities striking deals with Waze, with Uber, not realizing that there's no such thing as a free lunch. So yes, they want to help the city better and improve local mobility, for example. But there's a price to that, and the price to that is that you need to give your data to these people. And it goes somewhere in the cloud, and it's part of the city's assets and the city's property that just goes elsewhere. So there are a lot of things to think about when you look at data in cities. What we're finding in many cities is that the technology progressively is disappearing, and what's coming now are actual services. I think that for a long time the public hasn't been educated in the right manner. Data can be a very monstrous thing that people don't want. Digital can also scare a certain number of people, because again it was thought of as technology and infrastructure, not in terms of how does it produce services that are going to be useful to you in your daily life. And that's progressively changing in a very positive way. I'll just give you an example for mobility. When you tell people on billboards, you should take a bike rather than a car, they don't like this type of message. You're telling them what to do. People don't like you to tell them what to do. If you show them very simply that on a given portion of road, the people using a bike did that portion of road in 5 minutes, and those using a car did it in 30, you're saying a very, very different message. It's not an injunction to change your behavior, but it's educating people progressively to change their behaviors. And that's how data should be used in cities. And if they can do it with proprietary data or open data on their own territory, it's certainly for the better. Third chapter is about the art of sharing. A city, and its public space in particular, is a shared environment. And it's very difficult to share this environment. Very difficult. We still see in most cities, apart from maybe the Netherlands, it's complicated to be on a bicycle and to be with pedestrians. It's complicated to have the cars on the same road. So it still needs a lot of education. But what we see coming as a very important trend is that this sharing of public space will progressively evolve, and it will be the sharing of responsibility and local governance. You can't ask people to participate and to just tell you what they want for their city, what they want for their neighborhood, what they want for their environment, and just serve them as you would serve a consumer. You also need to bring them along so that they share the responsibility. And that's going to be difficult to do, but it will be necessary. Some cities have started doing very wide digital participation with their citizens. In general, they never reach more than 8 to 10% of that population. So digital is not the only solution for sure. And we see a lot of cities going back to local events. Digital, of course, it needs to be used, but a lot of local events, and again, working on the ground with people in their environment, in schools, etc. And that's the way, certainly, forward to share these assets that we have. A better sharing of public space. Another fun story from Paris. A year ago, the city of Paris said, well, if you want, since Paris is a city where people don't live in houses, they live in small apartments, if you want, we can deliver a permit to plant flowers around the city trees. So if you have a permit, then you can plant whatever you want around the trees, and the city is going to be more beautiful for everyone. Great. In some parts of the city, it works really well. In other parts, where I live, it's creating new frictions. The spaces around the trees were not considered as public space. Nobody cared about what happened around the public trees. But once somebody starts gardening those trees, it creates friction with the guys taking their dogs out for a walk, for example. So sharing is a necessity, but it's very difficult to do, even if you start just planting flowers around a tree. So there's a lot of headway for this type of thing to do, definitely. Cities have always been very versatile from the very beginning. The first Roman cities, they've always been very versatile. By versatile, we mean that a given space can have different types of uses. For example, a city market. So on the Wednesday, you just have cars in a street, and on the Thursdays it's going to be a city market. And it's the case absolutely all over the world. What we need to think about, and what a lot of cities are thinking about, is how can they take that model even further? Because there's a difference in the way that you use a given street during the day, in the evening, during the night. It's not the same populations, and most of the times it isn't the same needs exactly. So that needs to be taken into account for a very simple reason. It's because it creates service, and it creates the right type of service for the right people. So it creates quality of life. One of the examples that I like is it's a startup company called Storefront. And what Storefront do is that they are the booking.com of pop-up stores. When you look at any city and you look at any building, the occupancy rate is very poor. It's much, much lower than generally we think. So using those spaces to rent out for local businesses, for a fashion show, for a creator, for whatever, is also an idea that a lot of cities are looking at, because sometimes these spaces can be publicly owned. So it's becoming difficult for people to understand that some buildings are practically unoccupied, whereas at the same time the real estate prices are going up, and they can't get housing. So cities, to be accessible, to be used by the widest possible population need to be very flexible in the way that they use their space, be it public or even private. One of the domains in which citizens can also contribute is in creating the right types of services. I love this example on the right, and it's no surprise that it's in Copenhagen, because they have a very strong culture of collaborative design. I'm practically sure that if we had asked any designer to design these bins or this equipment for a bike lane, they would not have made them this way. I'm practically sure. Copenhagen is the only city where you see this type of thing. And people are happy about the service because they've contributed, and it shows that the city has a very fine and detailed understanding of what's needed. Sometimes you see services where you think, why did they put that there? Often it's because there's a grand plan for infrastructure, and the citizens haven't been asked if this was the right way to do it. And again, it's important to stress this, it's very difficult to do. And what's very interesting is to see that cities have embraced all these subjects, and they're all acting on this. They're piloting new services, they're starting to create more citizen participation, and again, you can see that absolutely everywhere in the world. And again, please read the book. It's very difficult to talk about 120 pages so quickly, but the last part is about the link between digital and agility. For a long time, and it was the vision of the smart city, when they thought about digital, it was an app for everything. So I have a parking app, I have an app to pay for the babysitter, an app to pay for the school meals, an app for this, an app for that. That's only the tip of the iceberg. What it actually means, what digital means in terms of transforming cities, is that cities need to inspire themselves of the way digital companies are functioning, being more agile, testing, learning, failing fast if a project isn't the right project, and just evolving in this test and learn way, in the way that they build their city services. The question behind that, and I don't think anyone has an answer to that, is once you've done all these little projects, what's the actual vision, the central vision that you have for your city? What's its personality? What's the grand plan? So we've come from a very top-down approach to more of a bottom-up approach, but there needs to be a balance between both of these approaches. And that's going to have us working for the next 20, 30 years maybe, or even more. Just an example I'd like to mention. A lot of cities and a lot of institutions have rankings of cities. The city where the universities are best, the city where the living standards are best, etc., etc., etc. And there's a new index, the Agility Index. How is this city capable of taking account of new problems or of new uses, and how quickly does it answer these new needs? It's becoming a part of those worldwide rankings. I haven't seen them yet, but anyway, that's where we're going. Sorry. So that was for the book, and please don't hesitate to look through it and download it. I haven't talked about each and every one of the contributors, but there's more than a dozen of them. Very clever thought leaders, each in their own area, be it creativity, local retail, etc., or university professors. But what I'd like to finish on is the way that we as a company, after having observing these trends, how do we act on them, and what's our vision for our future as a company? Now, the first thing is to put our 2 feet in the ground and leverage our core values. And it's very important because when, like JCDecaux on IGPDecaux, when you work in public spaces, in public land, it gives you a lot of responsibilities. It's a very difficult thing to go digging into public space. It's a very difficult thing to make sure that you have bus shelters that can last 10, 20, 30 years. We had a great example last week, and I don't want to stress this too much, but I don't know if you've heard about the World Cup in football, but we won it. And there were thousands, hundreds of thousands of people around Paris everywhere. And they were on the bus shelters, they were on the press kiosks, up to 30 people bouncing along on the roofs of the bus shelters. And it's our responsibility as a company to make sure that the bus shelter doesn't fall down. And it doesn't. Anyway, that was to say that it needs to be the ground upon which we can build different types of services. And we've always been a company very dedicated to innovation, to design, and the sustainability of what we do. A very quick example of that: whenever we clean our furniture, we do it with rainwater, and we do it with rainwater because, of course, it's more sustainable, but it's also a better way of cleaning. It cleans better than the water that you can get from a tap. So it's just a small example, but we really need to do this, and we actually do it absolutely all over the world. Now, one part of the future is to look at 4 different areas. The first is, how can we have a stronger, a wider, a thicker layer of services on those physical assets. We have close to 1.5 million different assets around the world. Of course, they provide services. When you wait for the bus, it's better to wait in a bus shelter than just outside in the street like you do in most cities in the US. So adding services on to existing assets, of course, is a very important thing to do. The second is to work on connectivity, and I'll get back to that. But connectivity, to make it short, having the best possible Wi-Fi when you're walking around the city, it's a commodity. It's like electricity. It's like having running water. It's a commodity. And cities are not yet very good at providing that essential service to their citizens. Now, of course, we're the world leader in outdoor communication, so making our products smart for all our clients is, of course, a very important area of development, and we need to do it with digital, of course, but through smart digital. I'll get back to that, but digital is not about putting screens in streets. It's about having a clever way of engaging with consumers, citizens, in the best possible way and to the benefit of the brands, of course. And I'll end with mobility. Bike sharing is a very strong service within JCDecaux. 2 days ago, we launched a new contract in the city of Lyon with a brand new client experience, completely new, completely digital. I'll get back to that, but it's already a success. Questions? Okay. Thank you. I'm sorry, but it's my passion, so 45 minutes is definitely not enough, but it's okay. 5 minutes more, then I'll take questions rather than go through each and every one of those areas, but I'll just say a few words about smart street furniture. When we started putting screens providing information and services in cities, some cities were coming to see us saying, well, you know, everyone is going to have a smartphone in their pockets. Why are you doing this? Why are we doing this? Because not everyone has a smartphone in their pockets. Not everyone has a powered up smartphone. And it's always easier to see a city map on a 32-inch screen rather than on this. So it's a very, very useful services. Again, when you put USB charging in bus shelters, do we really need USB charging in bus shelters? Yes, we do. All the delivery people on their bikes need to charge up 4 times a day, 5 times a day, and they use the bus shelters in Paris, for example. And another population we hadn't thought of were the homeless. A lot of homeless people in Paris, but one of the things that they own is a telephone. So being able to plug your telephone anywhere on public space in the city is a useful service. So back to basics, even though we can add digital layers and more services, but it needs to be useful to everyone. Do you have questions? Anyone, or things that you would like me to go back to? And please, if you want to ask your question in Italian, please feel free. I'm sure that Liviana will translate for me.
Hi. My question is, how do you combine smart cities with historical sites and buildings?
That's why the smart city is a model that's going to disappear in its actual form, because a smart city model works in Songdo City in the south of Korea when you decide to create a city from scratch. There you can do whatever you want. When you have historic sites, you can't do that. You can't do that. So you need to use personal devices whenever you can and make the integration as subtle as you can on public buildings, for example. But it's a thing that I didn't think about this particular point, because it's part of what we do on a daily basis at JCDecaux. It's part of what cities ask us to do. So I don't think it's a problem. But what I do think is that take a very beautiful museum in a historical site. These people are having trouble getting visitors to visit the museum. I think that one of the uses of digital in cities will be to take museums out of the building and in public space. It can be digital, it can be a part of the arts. So it's going to be probably a conversation with these people, but they definitely need, in a lot of cities, they need to raise the number of visitors, and public space and digital could help them do that.
Hi ma'am. Before you told like for a smart city we need to have better mobility factors. Do you think there are more concerns that should be met?
Can you just speak closer to the mic, please? I didn't hear you. I'm sorry.
About the mobility factors.
Yes.
Do you think there are substantially other significant parameters to tackle with, like if you take the financial aspects? If you take California during the 70s and 80s, it had a well-established tram network. But what happened was that company was bought out by Chrysler and Ford and General Motors. They bought the tram network, they scrapped everything, they removed the railroad so that they could sell more and more vehicles. It practically did. Now California has no tram network at all. So this is a financial aspect. You're meeting with a new giant that you're not used to. You can say like Denmark is good, but Denmark is a unique phenomenon. Netherlands is a unique phenomenon. The people, their mentality towards something better is different. So it is easy to penetrate into that market. But do you think it is possible on a global scale? And also you mentioned that 66% of the people will be living in the urban areas. But these urban areas are mainly focused on the Asian part. So that's a different kind of people. There are like different set of construction, city maps, everything. Layout is different, infrastructure is different, everything is different. So what do you plan to do about these diverse scenarios?
Okay. Thank you for your question, and there was actually several questions. The first one about California is very interesting because less than a year ago I met city officials from the city of Los Angeles, and they're just changing completely their view. because they think that it's possible to have more public transport than they have today, because it's a need for people. Otherwise, you will create a canyon between the city centres and the peripheries, and that's not acceptable. So they think that they can do that, all the while accepting the fact that there are going to be more autonomous cars, and people may want them, but I think that autonomous cars will actually be autonomous buses in the first inceptions. But people like the city of Los Angeles are really focusing much more on public transport than they're used to, because they've gone too far in a way. And to answer your second question about the very wide diversity of cities and of cultures, again, it's what we do. We operate in over 80 countries, 4,000 cities, very different cultures, but there's one thing that sort of unites them in a way, is that people move about in public spaces, and in many cities there are buses. There's some sort of public transport. So that's one of the ways of installing assets. But what we always do is adapt to the local situation, context, culture, etc. And for example, in some African cities, in Nigeria, there are two different problems. There's one problem linked to the car congestion, and we're helping them give more predictive information to people to reduce that congestion in the city centre of Lagos. And a very different city, very different size of city in Nigeria, where they're asking us whether we can build street furniture that can provide electricity, because it's a commodity that people don't have. So in some cases it will be Wi-Fi, in others it could be electricity, but in any case it will be one form of street furniture on public space. But of course we need to adapt to different situations.
But ma'am,
I can't hear you.
why do you prefer like Wi-Fi, right? It has severe consequences on our human body. Like there has been a study which treated like a plant which has been grown in an environment without Wi-Fi and with Wi-Fi, there was substantial difference. The plant that has been grown in the Wi-Fi environment had a stunted growth. So if you're planning to put it on an entire city, it will affect the total ecosystem of the city. The birds, they couldn't travel. Every kind of like human genome would be manipulated. So do you think stressing too much on Wi-Fi is a good thing or a bad thing?
That's really something I don't have an opinion about, because I don't know if it's good or bad. But what I do know is that we're very, very conscious of the effects on health and the effects on biodiversity, for example, in cities. And that's why we put Wi-Fi with, I don't want to go into the technical details, but we do that with equipment that are called small cells, that are situated on the top of bus shelters, and that enable to have a very high quality of Wi-Fi, of service, all the while reducing by a factor 4 or 5 the actual emissions, because they're tiny, very tiny local Wi-Fi points. So it's more sustainable than any other, but of course we're very conscious about these issues, definitely. But we need Wi-Fi, so unless there's a new technology, we still need Wi-Fi, in a way.
We are transcending into an age of 5G. So like the existing 4G systems that we have, the entire infrastructure will be taken away and the brand new 5G infrastructure will be coming. So it's like, you should be thinking into the future, not into the past, collecting memories, but we should be thinking about the future.
Well noted. Thank you. Okay, well, if that's it, thank you very much for your attention. Thank you.